Hello, and welcome back to Anatomy. Today we want to talk about reproduction, fertilization, and development because we've decided that the main goal of any species, any individual, is to survive long enough to reproduce, right? So how does this whole reproduction thing work? And the first question that we need to ask ourselves is, we know what reproduction is. We're pretty sure we know what fertilization is, although we're going to talk about it more today. But what is development, right? And so development is cell division, right? And that cell division results in growth, okay? And then the other thing that's going to happen is those cells will eventually differentiate and become specialized, because if you think about it, a skin cell is different than a bone cell, is different than a muscle cell or a brain cell, nerve cell, any of those things. Okay, now there are two very special cells that we want to talk about. And the first one is the egg, and the second one is the sperm. And we talked about both of these things when we were talking about the reproductive system. And I just want to recap that both of those, the egg and the sperm, are going to be haploid, which means they have half of the set of chromosomes that a diploid or a whole normal cell has. So, in order to get offspring, you have to get the egg and the sperm to fuse together. And what they produce is called a zygote, and that's the fertilized egg. And what you're actually looking at here, this is really cool. This is the fusion of the two pronuclei, because as the sperm enters, right, the egg, and in the case of a human cell, it's going to be, the sperm has to pass through the cumulus cells, and then it's got to get through the zona pellucida, and then it's going to merge with the egg membrane. And when it merges with the egg membrane, it's going to release its pronucleus into the egg, right? Because remember, the egg supplies everything that this new little offspring is going to need, right? And so the sperm is only providing that other half, that complement of the DNA. So these will fuse and hook up together. It's very exciting. Okay, so when we talk about the process of fertilization, here is an exciting picture. Okay? So the sperm has to get through these cumulus cells, and they were from the follicle, if you remember from the last conversation about this. So here you have the nucleus, and here's the tail, and this is just a recap about sperm. Here's the acrosome, and this is like vesicle that has these acrosomal enzymes, and they are going to be necessary to get through this shield, right, for all practical purposes, called the zona pellucida, that surrounds the egg. And a really cool thing is that once one of these little sperm gets through and actually fuses with the egg membrane, this whole reaction takes place that, for all practical purposes, seals the egg, and no other sperm can actually get through, and that's a block to polyspermy. Having more than one sperm fertilize an egg is called polyspermy, and it results in all sorts of problems, because you don't want to have that much DNA in there. You don't want to have that many chromosomes, and so that's a huge issue. So the cell will actually, the egg cell will protect itself once you have that sperm-egg merger, and it's actually a really cool thing. The tail over here is going to degrade and go away, as will the nuclei and everything that the sperm brought with it, except that pronucleus right here. So they're going to fuse, and then they're going to form this zygote nucleus. Okay, and this is what the first stage looks like. This is cleavage. And so you can see the egg is undergoing mitosis, right? Mitosis, as opposed to meiosis, which is something else we'll talk about in a minute. But mitosis, and this is the first step. Okay, so here's the fertilized egg. It's gonna divide into 2 cells, then 4 cells, and it's gonna keep on going. And you'll start to get this cavity in the center, right? And at this point, where it's this multicellular ball, but it still has the fertilization envelope around it. Okay, that was that zona pellucida, and then the protein sort of like shield that's around it. So this cavity will begin to form. It's still trapped in the membrane. At this point, it's called a morula, and then that membrane is going to degrade, and you're going to get this clearly defined what's called a blastocele. And you've got this nice little line of cells around here. Interestingly enough, though, and I think this is really important, as you look at this, you can see the volume of this does not change. The size of the cells changes, and so you're getting lots and lots of cells, but they're all crammed into the same area. So this single layer of cells, like there's one, there's one, there's one, there's one, it's kind of a really cool thing. Later on, you'll start to increase in volume, but at the blastula is the same volume pretty much as the fertilized egg. Okay, and here's just a nice picture of the morula. And then here's the blastula, and this is a little bit further on, and so you can see that the cells are replicating and you're getting a lot more cells. Here's the blastocele, which is that cavity inside. This cavity is very important, and we'll talk about it a little bit later. Okay, so what you're looking at here is cleavage in 3 different animals. And so this is going to take you from that very first division all the way to the blastula phase. And you can call it different things: blastoderm, blastula, blastocyst. Those are all fine. So anyway, we're going to go with blastula. But you've got this cleavage happening in different ways. And the reason I put this in here is that I want you to see this really unique way that birds and fish, they're meriblastic, and meriblastic means incomplete cleavage, and you do not have to know the terms meriblastic and holoblastic, but I want you to have heard them at some point. And what you get is cell division. It's really unequal, and so as it's dividing, you get these 2 small cells and the large cells down here. The small cells are the animal pole, and the large cells are the vegetal pole, and the vegetal pole later on is going to be the yolk. Right? And then here's going to be your little animal. But in mammals who don't have that, frogs, right, are there. They're dividing equally. But mammals are going to hook up to the placenta, and so they're really dividing equally, and you can see that there are differences between these 2 things, and we'll talk about that later on too. Okay, so this is just a review. We have fertilization, but this will give you an idea in terms of what we've talked about. So the sperm is going to travel up into the oviduct, fallopian tube, ovarian tube, whatever. And it's going to be fertilized here in the ampulla, right? We talked about that before. And then it's going to go ahead and divide as it's traveling down the oviduct. It will be at the morula stage when it actually enters into the uterus, and here's the early blastocyst. So this blastula or blastocyst is going to form. And you can see that here's a drawing, this single line of cells, and then there's a little cluster, this inner cell, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. At this point, it's going to implant in the uterine lining, okay, and it's going to snuggle up in there, and then we're going to start development. Okay, so this inner cell mass is actually going to become 2 layers of cells, and this is because you're going to get this edge here extending out, and then you're going to get that inner mass is going to start forming its own little ring of cells with a cavity, okay? And so you've got this cavity up here that's going to be the amniotic cavity, and then you have the cavity below here that's going to be the yolk sac. And the next phase after this is going to be gastrulation. And in gastrulation, a 3rd layer of cells forms in between these 2 layers. So you get this outer layer and an inner layer made from the same kinds of cells. I mean, they're all the same kind of cells. They're all embryonic cells. This split down the middle is called the embryonic disc. Then a middle layer begins to form, like in the center of that embryonic disc. And at the same time, you start to see this split, this cleaving right here. And this is called the primitive streak. Okay, so the embryonic disc phase, you have 2 layers. The gastrula is going to have 3. Okay, and gastrulation itself, this is a really cool thing. It is marked by the migration of cells. Cell migration is very, very important, and they will start to migrate, and they will invaginate, forming a hole, right? And so, like a little cavity. And so they'll come through here and fold in. And it's going to fold and continue to fold. And I'm going to show you a picture. But this, think of the word gastrulation. Gastrulation is probably a lot like gastric. This is actually the formation of the digestive tube. This is the first, well, it's the beginning. It's not the actual tube that's going to develop. But this is where it's going to develop. This is the initial thing. So really, the first things to form actually is this later on will become the anus. And so this is going to be the digestive tract. Okay, and an interesting thing is that the pattern of gastrulation is going to be different in different species because the amount of yolk really makes a big difference. And we're not actually going to talk about this, but different organisms are going to do this differently based on yolk, right? And so yolk is really the key kind of mitigating factor in how gastrulation occurs. But when you look here, that cell that was originally forming with the blastocyst or blastula is going to be the ectoderm, right? And ecto, outside, okay? This other set of cells that have begun to fold and form that little cluster, that is the endoderm. And then the cells that formed in between those are going to be the mesoderm, okay? And so you see this folding, right? You've got this nice little folding in here, right? So here's the blastopore, right? Here's the ectoderm and the endoderm. And the standard for these is that the ectoderm is blue, the endoderm is yellow, and the mesoderm is red. Okay, so we put it all together. We can see we start with the zygote, we go through cleavage, more cleavage, until we get to be a blastula. The blastula has the blastocele in it. Gastrulation occurs as that folds in and the cells begin to grow in these layers, and you form the blastopore, which will later become the anus, right? And so gastrulation. Now, the next thing that's going to happen is neurulation, and this is going to be the nervous system. Now, the nervous system, even though the digestive tube is beginning to form and is really the first thing that starts forming, the nervous system is actually the first system to develop, and that's because it's going to control everything else, right? And the formation of this is called neurulation. And neurulation, that formation of the nervous system, is required to develop the rest of the organs, and that's called organogenesis, okay? Now, the notochord is going to be the key factor in here, okay? And this is actually a really, really cool thing. So we're going to go through, well, it's all really cool. I mean, I'm just going to tell you it's all really cool. Okay, so we're going to go through. The notochord right here is actually formed in the mesoderm, okay, or mesoderm, you can say it either way. And it's going to be this little line, and then the ectoderm that covers it, right above it, is going to be called the neural plate. And the notochord actually sends signals to the ectoderm that induces these cells to form this neural crest and neural tube, which will eventually become the spinal column. The notochord itself does not, right? This does not become the spinal cord. It's the cells above it that do, but it's the notochord that's like the director. It's like the conductor of a symphony. It's very exciting. You do not have to know each of these steps, but we are going to do them in class so you can actually see the progression from those 3 germ layers to something that's going to be more comprehensive. Now, after neurulation, organogenesis is going to occur. And each of those 3 layers, the endoderm, the mesoderm, and the ectoderm, and I have to say, while I like this picture because it gives you what all of these things are going to become, it doesn't follow the standard, right? So this should be blue, this should be yellow, this should be red, and this should be blue. So kind of ignore that. That's just, it's so wrong, right? But this one is right. See, you see the ectoderm, the animal pole. Okay, so the ectoderm is the animal pole. The vegetal pole is where the endoderm is here, and then the mesoderm is in between, okay? Now, this is obviously a whole lot more complex, right? But what I want you to understand is that the endoderm is going to be the really interior stuff. It's going to be the respiratory system, and it's going to be the digestive system, okay? The ectoderm is going to be on the outside. That is going to be the integumentary system. It's going to be the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So the nervous system, the skin, and everything that goes with the skin. It's also going to form the lens and your inner ears. So you're looking at endoderm, digestive, respiratory. Ectoderm, integumentary, nervous, and then the mesoderm is going to form all the other things we talk about. You're going to see you've got, it formed the notochord, which is going to go away. Here's the skeletal system, the muscular system, the reproductive system, the urinary system or excretory system, the circulatory system. Those are all going to be from the mesoderm, okay? So please know the general systems that are coming from each layer. Okay. Okay, now, what about humans? What of all of this is specific to humans? Okay, so when we look at our little cell, this is a 12-day-old human, right? And so this is where it's implanted into the uterine wall, right? Here's the uterine wall right here. And then here's that embryonic disc we were talking about. There's the amniotic cavity, and then here's the yolk cavity, right? The blastocele. Okay. Now, that is going to start to divide and grow bigger. And at this point, you're kind of like a fish, right? And you can see this is a 1-month-old human embryo. And so here you can see the yolk sac, the placenta is developing. Now, we are placental mammals, which means that we are connected to our offspring all of the time when they are developing inside the female. But until that placenta can develop, the baby still has to eat, right? And so there's a yolk sac that's up front that will go away. It's very small. It's not like that in the sharks or the or chickens or anything like that. It's very small, but it's necessary right up front. Now, here's the cool thing. This is the heart, right? And the heart and the brain are forming very much at the same time, okay? The heart is, of course, pumping all the blood that's necessary, and you can see the precursors to most of all of these systems. Here's the eye here that's going to form, but there's the heart, and you can actually watch it beat. It's very, very cool. Here is the beginning of little arms. You get a little nubby, and this is the tail, right? Here's a leg bud. This tail is going to get reabsorbed, but it's very interesting to see, and this goes to that same idea that you can really see our heritage. And by saying our heritage, I mean the similarities that we have with the animals that we arise from evolutionarily. And even though this is going to get reabsorbed, in early development, in this first trimester of all vertebrates, you can actually see similarities to other organisms in their first trimester that show our relatedness. Okay. Oh, and here's the other fun part. Somites, they will later become the vertebra. Yeah, very exciting. Okay. Now, gastrulation is going to occur during this time. It's going to occur in the 2nd week. It's really, really early. The HCG, by the way, is the human chorionic gonadotropin. This is the hormone that is tested for in pregnancy tests. And once the egg is fertilized and it's doing its little thing, it's sending out signals, and then the placenta starts releasing this HCG that's going to help with all sorts of pregnancy things. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But anyway, so gastrulation is going to occur in the 2nd week. Neurulation occurs about a week later. Okay? And then organogenesis is really going to begin at the end of this 1st month. Okay? In the 2nd month, you get your little miniature limbs. Okay? Your major organs like the liver and the stomach and the intestines are going to start to become apparent, right? You're about 25 millimeters, so tiny. That's 2.5 centimeters. That's about an inch. Okay? Weighs about the same as a paperclip and looks more or less human. In the 3rd month, this is going to be the transition at the end of the 3rd month from embryo to fetus. So if you're ever wondering about embryonic development versus fetal development, embryonic development is in the 1st trimester. Fetal development is the 2nd and 3rd trimester. Now, at this point, your nervous system is really going to develop fully. Your brain is already, starting to send signals to everything, but this is where the rest of it is going to start going. The baby can start moving its little limbs. The embryo can start moving its limbs. And at this point, the HCG is going to decline, and that corpus luteum that we learned about when we learned about ovaries is going to degenerate. Okay? The placenta is going to be the hormone secretor at this point, right? One of the big hormones is actually progesterone, and we'll talk about that in a second. Now, at the beginning of this 3rd month, the head growth, which was growing probably more than anything else, is going to start to slow down, and the body is going to start catching up with the head. Although I'd like to point out that newborns, their head is like 25% of their length. Okay. Now, at this point, also bones, ossification, the making bony bones, is going to happen here. And then this is the point where you can actually determine the sex of the baby. Now, body plan is going to continue to develop in the 2nd trimester. The bones are going to enlarge by the 4th month. You're really, really growing. Now, you can actually take a stethoscope and put it on the mother's stomach, and you can hear the heartbeat. Now, you've been be able to hear the heartbeat for a long time with ultrasound, and you could see it with ultrasound. I'm sorry, you could hear it with Doppler, and you could see it with ultrasound. But now you can actually just use a regular old stethoscope, which is kind of cool. Now, by the end of the 6th month, you've got this fetus that's about 30 centimeters long, or about a foot or so, and it weighs about 600 grams. Okay, so this is what it's going to look like at 3 to 4 months. You can see that it looks human. If it were a little fuzzier, it might be a little chimp-like, but it's definitely human at this point looking. And you can see beautifully the umbilical cord, and when we dissect the pig, you'll actually see that, and you'll get to see what's going on in that umbilical cord, which is pretty neat. Oh, and there's a little rib cage, little ear, little hands, and they can open and close their hands. Okay, at 6 months, this is clearly a baby, right? And so you can even see the fingernails there. You can see all of the features of the face very clearly, even little eyebrows, right? It's very, very cute. And really cool in this picture, I love, is you can see all of the arteries and veins underneath the skin, which is pretty cool. Okay, now, the 3rd trimester is all about growth and organ maturation, and so this is the most growth that the baby is going to do is during this month. And this picture actually is in German. Sorry about that, but this says 6 months right there, and so this is day 60 to 63, day 56 to 60. But anyway, you can see that progression from this, and then your little fish action here, right? Kind of look like a chicken at some point, to this, and I think that's pretty neat. Okay, so the fetus is going to double in weight, like several times. I mean, you're going from like ½ pound to being born at somewhere between 6 and 9 pounds is a good average, so that's a lot of growth in 3 months. Okay. Now, the other thing is most of the major nerve tracts in the brain are going to be formed at this point, but interesting thing is that the brain is going to continue to develop and produce neurons for months and months after birth, up to 3 years maybe. But your brain doesn't fully stop developing until you're around 25, and so the brain is the slowest thing to develop, and interestingly enough, the big brain is one of the reasons that we have the social structure that we do, because we need to care for these little babies. But it's that big brain that makes us born before we can do anything sort of constructive, because you have to get that big brain out through the pelvis. So it's kind of funny that it's the thing that forces us to be born earlier than other mammals, like comparable, and is the thing that takes really the longest to develop. Okay, now here's a fun thing. Ernst Haeckel noticed that adults of vertebrates and some arthropods actually look really different when they're adults, but there's a stage of development that's going to occur kind of after gastrulation, but towards the middle to end of the 2nd month, and you're to find that the embryos look pretty similar. I mean, this is a salamander, this is us, this is a rabbit, this is a chicken, and that's a fish. And obviously some of them look more closely related, but when you start looking at like these guys, there's not a lot of difference. These guys, not a lot of difference. So what we've got represented here, of course, is a fish, an amphibian, a bird, and 2 mammals. And so really, really interesting thing there. Now the other thing too is that you can look at things that are not vertebrates, and you can see, here's the insect, look, there's the ectoderm, here's the mesoderm, here's the endoderm, and you can see similarities. While this is much more complex, you still see some of the same features, and that's really cool. Okay, and then this is, what you were seeing here, this is actually Haeckel's real drawings. That's what he drew. And this is, of course, what it would look like if you could actually see it, right? And so, I love the bat. I'm just going to say right up front. Anyway, so here's some really cool little snake, chicken, possum, cat, bat, and human, and they all look like they're going to in this late form. And in the middle form, you're starting to see some really striking differences. But look at this early development right here. This is really just very striking at how similar they are. Okay, there's our little tail, and there's our pharyngeal pouches, which, reminiscent of gills. Okay, anyway, that's it for today. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I will see you in class. Thanks for listening.